In this video, we're going to review how to solve rational equations. Rational equations contain fractions. So for a rational equation, notice that we have a denominator that contains a variable. And so sometimes when you solve these equations, you might get a value that makes the denominator 0. And so if you happen to get an answer that makes the denominator 0, then you would have to say no solution. So we have to write down the restrictions on the denominator. That way we remember at the end to check. So the restrictions in this case, remember you cannot divide by 0. So we just want to make sure we find the value or values of the variable that make the denominator 0. So all you really have to do, in this case we have the same denominator. You can calculate this in your head or you can write it out. You just want to take the denominator and just write not equal to 0, and then we solve and we get that a should not be -2. And that's our restriction. So we just put that here. Some problems have more than one restriction because they'll have different denominators. So this is here again because if we solve our equation and we happen to get -2 as the answer, then you would write no solution because we cannot divide by 0. The next thing we want to do is find the least common denominator. In this case, there is only one denominator, so the LCD is going to be a plus 2. The next step is to multiply both sides of the equation so that we can eliminate all fractions, and you multiply by the LCD. Make sure you understand that you need to multiply every part of this equation. So we multiply both fractions and we also have to multiply 5. Even though 5 is not really a fraction, you still have to multiply by a plus 2. Whatever you do to one part of the equation, we have to do to both parts of the equation. And so I'm going to take that equation, multiply everything by a plus 2. And you can write this out. I'm just going to actually recopy the problem here. And then I'll show you when you multiply, you are multiplying in the numerator. Okay, so every single part of this equation. And notice that we can reduce. So that's the whole point here, is that you can just reduce, right? So the fractions go away. That's the idea that we're using here. Multiply by the LCD will eliminate all fractions. And so if you eliminate, we're just left with 2a minus 5 times a plus 2 is equal to, again, that's eliminated, we get 7a. You need to use the distributive property. Combine like terms. And then we solve for a. Notice that the exponent for your variable, the highest exponent is exponent 1. Sometimes the highest exponent will be 2. So you want to pay attention to the type of equation you are left with at the end. It will tell you how to solve your problem. And so from here, I'm just going to subtract 7a and add 10. Right? Combine your like terms. Divide by -10, so a comes out to be -1. So as long as -1 is not the restricted value, then we should be okay. You can check your answer by taking -1 and substituting it back into the original equation just to check to make sure that this is correct. So I'm going to skip the checking step, but you should always check your answer for any equation to make sure it's correct. Let's take a look at the second example. So same type of a problem. We have an equation that contains fractions. We want to list the restrictions. So again, you look at your two denominators. We only care about the denominator that contains a variable. So this is the only denominator I care about. And again, you can calculate the restriction in your head, or you can write x minus 4. We do not want that to be 0 because I don't want to divide by 0. It'll be undefined. And then we solve and we get that x should not be 4. So if you look at this carefully, if you substitute 4 here, 4 minus 4 is 0. So again, we don't want 0 in the denominator because we can't divide by 0. So that's the restriction. Our LCD, in this case, we have two different denominators. And so the LCD will be the product in this case. It's going to be 6 times x minus 4. And so what we're going to do is multiply every part, both sides of the equation, by the LCD to clear fractions. You remember are multiplying in the numerator. So again, the whole idea here is that we can reduce. And so right here, I can reduce x minus 4. And right here, I could reduce 6. Remember that you need to multiply. So this is 6 times x that we're left with. And over here, we're left with x plus 4 times x minus 4. So this is a product where you need to FOIL. And so I'm going to write it out that way. So make sure you understand you need to FOIL. And so once we have it written this way, notice the fractions are gone. So we do have to FOIL right here. Very important. And so we're going to FOIL. We get 6x. If you FOIL and combine like terms, we end up with x squared minus 16. So the one thing you want to notice here is that the highest exponent for this equation is 2. The previous example, I pointed out that the highest exponent was 1. Well, if your highest exponent is 2, it probably means that you need to factor to solve. And in order to factor and solve, you do need to get a 0 on one side. And so that means that before I factor, I need to make sure there's a 0 on one side of the equation. So let me just add that here. You need to have a 0 on one side. And then we need to factor. Okay, so get the 0 first and then factor. So all I'm going to do is subtract 6x. This is a trinomial. You need to put it in the correct order in order to factor. So it's going to look like this. Okay, so this is familiar. We've done this before. We just factor our trinomial, and we're going to, again, write 2 parentheses. And you just factor. The signs should be opposite. And then we just write what we get. So it should be minus 8 and then plus 2. So remember, you check, make sure you get negative 6, which we do in this case. And then to solve, we just set each factor here equal to 0. So I can say x plus 2 is equal to 0. X minus 8 is equal to 0. And then I get my 2 solutions. I'm going to get that x is negative 2, x is equal to 8. Just make sure that neither of these 2 values are the restricted value. In this case, none of these are 4, so we're okay. So this will be your answer. Again, you should take both solutions, plug them into the original equation, and check your work. Next example. So again, what we want to do is find the restriction or restrictions, find the LCD, eliminate fractions, and then solve. This problem's different. It's different because if you look at the second denominator, this is not factored. So if you have a problem where the denominator is not factored, you do need to factor first and then find the restrictions and the LCD. So factoring needs to be done first. So I'm going to put factor. All right, so we're going to factor. The first part is already simplified. The second fraction needs to be factored. That is a difference of 2 squares, and so we factor it that way. Okay, all the denominators are factored. The restrictions, in this case, there are 2 restrictions. Notice that we have x plus 2, and we also have x minus 2. So those 2 will give us 2 restrictions. For x plus 2, the restriction is that x cannot be negative 2. For x minus 2, the restriction is that x cannot be positive 2, because if you plug in positive 2, we get 0. If I plug in negative 2 here, I get 0. We don't want to divide by 0. The LCD in this case, since we have 2 different denominators, the LCD is the product. So that would be x plus 2 times x minus 2. This is what we want to multiply every single part of the equation so that we can clear the fractions. So let's go ahead and write this out. So I'm going to multiply every part of this equation by the LCD. Okay, so remember, when you're multiplying, you are multiplying in the numerator. Okay, so I multiply this fraction, I multiply the second fraction, and then this one. Okay, so from here, we are going to just reduce what we have. And so for this part, I can reduce x plus 2, x plus 2. We're left with 1 times x minus 2. That's just x minus 2. Here, I can actually reduce all of these, and we're just left with 4. And then very careful here, there's a negative sign. It's minus and then 1 times. You do need to distribute this negative. This is where people tend to make mistakes. You got to be a little bit careful. We can reduce x minus 4. So it's negative 1 times x plus 2. I'm going to write it this way just to remind ourselves that we need to distribute that negative sign. So fractions are cleared. We're going to solve this as a regular equation. The highest exponent for x is 1, so I don't have to factor, I just solve it directly. Combine like terms. Once we get to this point, we're going to basically just solve here for x. We can add x to both sides, and I can add 2. So x plus 2, we get 2x is equal to 4. And then from here, we're going to get that x comes out to be 2. All right, so we got to be careful because we have our answer as 2, and I noticed that when I go back to look at the restrictions, one of the restrictions is that x can't be 2, because if you substitute 2 into any of these denominators, but specifically this one and this one, we're going to get division by 0. So we cannot have this answer. So actually x cannot be 2, and in this case you have to write no solution. That is the correct answer for this type of a problem. So this can happen sometimes where you get an answer and it doesn't work because we cannot divide by 0. last example. So right here we have a similar type of example where we notice that one of the denominators is not factored. And so we do need to factor first before we do anything else. So let's go ahead and do that. So that's just a regular trinomial. The signs are both positive. I need factors of 12 that are going to give me 7. So that's going to be 3 and 4. So just quickly check, make sure this is factored correctly, and we recopy the last part. Okay, once everything is factored in the denominator, then we can state the restrictions. There will be 2 restrictions here. One of them says that x plus 3 cannot be 0. And the other one is x plus 4 cannot be 0. So this one says that one of the restrictions is that x cannot be -3, x cannot be -4. Okay, so those are the 2 restrictions. And our LCD, again, I have 2 different factors. The LCD is just the product. So this will be the LCD, the product. This is what we're going to multiply every part of this equation by to clear the fraction. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, again, we can reduce. In this case, x plus 4 goes away. In this case, all of that goes away, and also x plus 3. All right, now that I have reduced, for the first fraction, we're left with 3 times x plus 4 equals. The second part, we're just left with 12x plus 19 minus 5 multiplied with x plus 3. Notice that we have to distribute -5, and we also have to distribute 3. So let's go ahead and do that. Combine like terms. The highest exponent for the variable is 1, so this will just be solved like a regular equation. We do not need to get a 0 on one side or factor. So what I'm going to do is subtract 7x and subtract 12. And divide, we get that x comes out to be 2. 2 is not a restricted value, so that's good. Again, you want to take 2, substitute it into the original problem, and just make sure that it's correct. But this is our answer, and that is the last example.